Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Professor Patman has just returned from North America and Europe, two continents that have been in the crosshairs during the first days of Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States. Welcome, Robert.
Rona, Bruce. Thank you.
What reactions have you seen and heard to Trump's foreign policy salvos since his inauguration 10 days ago?
Well, I may have been limited. I may have been circulating in limited circles, but and I didn't speak to government decision makers in either Canada or Germany or the Netherlands. But I did get, if you like, a layman's view of the atmosphere in those countries. And in my discussions with various people, there was no great enthusiasm for what Mr. Trump has been pronouncing in terms of a number of foreign policy comments he's made. In particular, Canada, this was a very interesting exercise. I think right across the political divide, there is barely veiled anger with Mr. Trump's position. I remember talking to a chap in the airport who confessed to me he'd never voted for Trudeau and always been a lifelong Conservative. But he said that Mr. Trump's characterisation of Canada as a possible 51st state was outrageous and an insult to a neighbouring country of 40 million people, and what, in geographical terms, was bigger than the United States. So I think there's, I think that does represent a view within Canada. There's been a lot of humour about it, of course. Canadians offering to build a wall at their own expense to insulate themselves from the Trump administration. In Europe, there's also worries. In both the Netherlands and Germany, what I picked up in discussions with academics and students was they felt that Mr. Trump's real enemies were respectively NATO and the EU. And they noticed that Mr. Trump was ambiguous about his relations with authoritarian states. So I think, to sum up, I think there was a feeling in both Canada and in Europe, in both Germany and in Netherlands, both countries have are being challenged by populism at the moment, that Mr. Trump's advent of Mr. Trump to the White House is likely to make life more difficult for the foreign policies of those two countries.
And in what ways do you think that Trump 2.0 appears different to his first presidency?
Oh, I think the crucial difference, Bruce, is that Mr. Trump has made it quite clear that all his senior appointments will be made on the basis of loyalty rather than competence. So he could be in a situation where, from his point of view, all his policies will be delivered smoothly without too many obstacles. So we're getting a much rawer version of Mr. Trump than in the first administration. But whether it will be competent and whether it will add up remains to be seen. Already Mr. Trump has contradicted himself in a number of areas, saying on the one hand that Mr. Putin's war or invasion, we keep using that term war when in fact it's an invasion of a sovereign country, Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a ridiculous war, and he threatened Mr. Putin with sanctions if he didn't withdraw. On the other hand, the next day, Mr. Trump said Zelensky really should have done more to prevent the invasion, which led many diplomats scratching their heads, since when does the victim of aggression have responsibility for inviting the aggression? So I think this is just one example, but I do think Mr. Trump is going to have difficulties in not only presenting a coherent policy, but also in winning international support. No one doubts the United States is really powerful. The question is whether that power will translate into international respect.
Right. And Trump is threatening many countries with tariffs and sanctions. And in fact, if he doesn't get his own way. And this appears to have been effective with Colombia. So is this actually just a more efficient way of doing things than going through international organisations and processes which can often take many years to bear fruit?
It might be more efficient for the most powerful country in the world dealing with a small neighbour, which is to bully and threaten them. And this is what we're talking about. Do what we want, otherwise you face 25% tariffs, which Mr. Trump and his press spokesperson depicted the outcome, because Colombia caved in, effectively, because they couldn't face 25% tariffs in their trade with the United States, which is vital for them. He depicted that as America was being respected again. I'm not sure that's the case. And let's look beyond a neighbouring country of the United States. What does that mean for middle powers and small powers around the world? Rules and processes are not put in place to protect the powerful. They're put in place to protect the weaker members of the international community. I don't think Mr. Trump will be able to do this on every issue. He's already seeing pushback from the Mexican leadership, and we can't read too much into that outcome. From Mr. Trump's point of view and his supporters, the MAGA supporters, it looks like vindication. I would say it's too early to say.
Will Trump's demands that other countries greatly increase their military spending, will this actually weaken US influence in the long term?
Well, let's be clear. The United States is responsible for more than 40% of the world's arms exports. And in fact, 2023, I think it was 50%. So it's a very high figure. So when Mr. Trump urges everyone to spend more on defence, many countries will see that as a very cynical move, that he's urging them to buy more American arms. Again, it could have unintended consequences. It may mean that countries may retaliate by buying their arms from elsewhere. I don't think that's necessarily the case, and certainly liberal democracies may have problems with that. But I think what it could do is make many countries, including our own, recognise that they cannot rely on the United States in the way that they did in the past, where it was assumed that since the United States had been responsible for much of the architecture of the rules-based international order, that they would take a lead in trying to uphold that order. And I think that assumption has unravelled rapidly. The second Trump administration, in my view, is a much more radical version of the first, and it raises real questions for other liberal democracies.
So picking up on that, is it now actually too late for the international rules-based order?
I think the international rules-based order, or sometimes called the liberal order, which is enshrined in institutions like the UN and depends on the application of rules through international law, I think it's been under strain throughout the post-9/11 period. We had the illegal American invasion of Iraq, which created a precedent for China to ignore a ruling on the South China Sea by the Hague Tribunal in 2016, and it also created a precedent for Russia's annexation of Crimea and subsequent full-scale invasion. So there's no doubt about it. The international rules-based order is under strain, but we've got to put this in perspective. And it's often lost, unfortunately, in much of the commentary analysis that's going on. We live in a world that's ever more interconnected. Just today I was listening about quantum computers and also the momentum of AI. America doesn't have a monopoly on these processes. Recently, the Chinese shocked America, particularly the high-tech sector, by introducing their own AI version. Is it deep learning or deep something?
DeepSeek, I think.
DeepSeek, yes. And it's free. So America's facing real competition. And this is, and that leads me to another point. Many of the key challenges facing all states, whether they be superpowers, whether they be middle powers, whether they be small powers like in New Zealand, many of these key problems, and they're multiplying, do not respect borders. In short, Mr. Trump seems to be assuming he can fix all the world's problems if only the world lets him. In fact, he can't. And on those problems that he feels uncomfortable with, he often denies they exist, such as climate change. But the United States is going to face problems of climate change, like many other countries, in the next 4 years. So it's not over, because how do you solve those problems, Bruce, that do not recognise borders? An international free-for-all will see these problems unaddressed. If we see a further erosion of multilateral cooperation, then we can say goodbye to solving climate change, we can say goodbye to solving global pandemics, we can say goodbye to solving problems like transnational terrorism.
Right. So how do you expect what are you expecting of world leaders? Are they likely to follow Trump's lead, or are they likely to push back against it? How do you think this is going to play out?
I think in the short term, they will try to reach an agreement with the Trump administration. I think this is dangerous because I think it will only embolden Mr. Trump to make further demands. But there will come a point where, and we're not too far off it, where many liberal democracies will recognise that the Trump administration bears no resemblance to the America that has been very much in evidence in the post-45 era. And once that recognition occurs, then I think many countries will begin to be more vigorous in defending their interests. Look, I'm not holding my breath on this. If you look at the New Zealand government, it's quietly trying to, I believe, negotiate an exemption to the 10% tariff that comes its way, and I'm sure that is the position of the British government and many other governments. But Mr. Trump is riding roughshod over institutions which serve New Zealand's national interests. And there's going to come a point where New Zealand has to say, can we really accept American diktat on issues like the Ukraine? Are we comfortable with America cutting off its military support for Ukraine? Are we comfortable with being a potential member of AUKUS under Mr. Trump's leadership? So these are real challenges, and I think what it does lead is for New Zealand to embrace the possibility of spending more on defence itself, to ensure it has more autonomy on decisions that matter to this country. But as I say, I think in the short term, many countries like New Zealand will try to reach agreement with the Trump administration. In the longer term, I think they will have to make tough choices about whether they can go along with Mr. Trump's radical vision of international relations run by great powers and largely to the exclusion of small and middle powers.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.